So welcome everybody to this research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. My name is Gustav Arrhenius. I'm the director of the Institute. And today I'm very happy to have Sanja Bogojević and Åsa Romson here to talk about infrastructure for the 21st century, how climate change shapes society and law. Sanja is a fellow and associate professor of law at Lady Margaret Hall and the faculty of law at Oxford University, and she used to be at Lund University before that, and even earlier she did a DPhil at my old college, Corpus Christi College in Oxford. And of course she's very well known for the research she's done in environmental law and EU law more broadly. And then also we have here Åsa Romson. And she currently works as an expert in environmental law and environmental politics at the IVL Swedish Environmental Research Institute. And before that, she was the Vice Prime Minister and the Minister for Climate and Environment in the Swedish government from 2014 to 2016. Most importantly, she is the Vice Chairman of the Institute's board. I must say, that's the most important thing to mention there. And she completed a doctorate in environmental law at Stockholm University in 2012, and her thesis was Environmental Policy Space and International Investment Law. Actually, I think we met the first time, Åsa, when you were promoted to a doctor and I was promoted to a professor in City Hall. That was very nice. Anyway, very welcome both, and the floor is yours. I don't know how you're dividing it up, but whoever wants to start talking, now you can start talking.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Gustav, for the introduction. I should say, just as an introductory point, the talk we're going to present today is based on a paper that Åsa and I are currently writing. And this is the first time we are presenting our ideas to an audience. So we are very keen and curious to get your views and comments, and it's going to be a fluid conversation between Åsa and I, in the sense that we haven't rehearsed this previously. Åsa, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, just as an introduction.
Well, not more than clarify that for this talk you are in lead, as you also kindly invited me to both to this co-work on the article that we are still debating, and also to this talk. So I'm very happy to be your sidekick here, and also to enjoy the conversation with the others on this topic.
Okay. Great. So unfortunately, it's probably going to be slightly annoying on my part by having to say next slide, please. But Starleaf didn't allow me the function to share my screen. So next slide, please. And then I'll chat. You can probably, whoever is in charge of, we can click through the whole overview. So today we're going to discuss, and if we just going to go back, sorry. Great, that slide. So today we're going to discuss infrastructure, and infrastructure is the bedrock of modern society. So it connects us, it enables face-to-face meetings, which we've all missed in this past year. It leads to exchange of ideas, melting of cultures, flourishing of economies. So zooming in on airports, they especially are often thought of as icon of modernity. But how do we then reconcile these features of what we understand as a modern society with the recognized need to deal with climate change and change in energy structures of the past? So this is really what our talk in this paper is about. So to think about these issues in detail, we first, however, do need to pause and reflect on, well, what kind of problem is climate change from the legal perspective? So what kind of problem is climate change as a legal problem? So here we focus on two issues. We need to think about climate change through legislation and how it has been addressed through legislation. and also by the courts in adjudicating climate change. So by that I mean the meaning that the courts have given climate change. We're going to focus on Sweden as a case study here. And then the question is, well, why Sweden? Beyond the fact that we're presenting this at the Institute, which is based in Sweden, obviously. Both Åsa and I are Swedish. Åsa is also, as Gustav has pointed out, a Swedish environmental lawyer. But Sweden is interesting beyond these kind of personal traits of ours. It has ambitious climate change laws in place. At the same time, there are multiple airport expansion plans underway. In a sense, this is not unique to Sweden. We have similar laws. We have similar expansion plans for airports also in the UK. But what is interesting with Sweden is that the courts have been restrained in adjudicating climate change. And we'll consider what effect this has had on how climate change and infrastructure are imagined, and what role the courts may have in the future, or how their role may change in the future. So tied to this, and finally, what we're going to do in the talk today, and what we're going to focus on, is looking at kind of these 3 points that we hope to discuss. Is to what extent do we need to rethink the law? So not just climate law, but more generally law. Do we need to rethink the role of courts in Sweden? And is also innovation a safe haven? So can innovation also provide the road where we can reconcile our ideas of infrastructure of the past and a future where we deal with climate change? So this is generally what we'll talk about today. So just also, whenever you feel that you want to add, you just jump straight in. But for now, I'll just move on. So if there, similarly to whoever is in the audience, I only see Åsa, but whoever is in the audience, if there are any questions, do jump in. But I also know that we have time reserved for questions afterwards.
Yeah, I can jump in there. So in the chat,
Okay.
You haven't seen that, we put in, if you have a question or clarification, you put it in the chat. And then I will pick it up when I find it's suitable. But that's the way how we run it here. So people writing question clarification. If there's a bigger question, we wait to the question period.
Okay, great. So I, just for also clarifications, I didn't see the chat, but Gustav, as you pointed out, you will raise that point. Okay. So next slide, please. So this is just the first part where we're going to talk about infrastructure. So next slide. Great. So infrastructure, as we've already pointed out, holds a central place in society. Yet we rarely, or at least not in law, and this includes in environmental law, pause to discuss it. Well, why is that? One reason that Gupta proposes, and I should say that there is a reference list at the end of the presentation, what he proposes is that infrastructure disappears from consciousness. In the sense that he then argues, in the sense that it's often a solid, immovable object that we're talking about. So infrastructure quickly becomes part of a background that we then take for granted. Yet infrastructure is essential in how we structure societies. In a wonderful book by that I've referenced here by Vollmer on the history of trains in America, if anyone's interested, he describes how America was made by the railroads. And this is because infrastructure, obviously consists of a variety of networks. But despite the rarity, what they do is that they contribute to the creation of markets, especially at the global scale. So infrastructure facilitates the flow of goods, of people, of ideas, and it allows their exchange over space. So in establishing this circulation, infrastructure acts as a mechanism for integration for people as well as economies. So if we take the ancient Silk Road as an example, and this is the work by Frank Koppen, who looks both at the ancient Silk Road and the new Silk Road developed by or pursued by China. He says that the Silk Road doesn't represent a road per se, rather it represents the way in which people, cultures, and continents were woven together, and in doing so, they help us better understand the way that religions, languages spread in the past, showing also our ideas about food, fashion, and art were disseminated, completed, and borrowed from each other. So the point here is to really kind of underline that infrastructure really is about market connectivity. So it's about breaking down oppressive barriers among cultures, races, languages, and nations. So this suggests that there is great fluidity, but infrastructure, as explained by anthropologists Harvey and Knox, exists as, and this is probably my favorite explanation of infrastructure, it exists as state space. So what this means is that physical infrastructure is planned, it is executed, and it's most commonly owned by the state. So it doesn't occur haphazardly. In other words, how we organize our societies and how the infrastructure that we choose is a collective choice. So although we are familiar with the picture, we obviously know many examples of protesters around controversial infrastructure plans, and we'll come back to that. The general idea of infrastructure is projected in a promotional way. So after all, who wants to be part of society that is isolated, that is cut off, that is alienated, that is alone? And so if we go to the next slide, please. So although we appreciate that infrastructure is an inherent part of society and how we structure society, and in a sense it's a hallmark of a modern society, we are familiar with the idea that infrastructure does have an environmental impact. And this was very nicely captured by Baroness Hale in a huge constitutional case before the Supreme Court in the UK some years ago. So the HS2, I don't know if anyone from the audience have followed the development of HS2, but this is a fast railroad track that will run from London across the United Kingdom and connect the country from south to the north. And this was litigated for not having, one of the questions was that there was no environmental impact assessment made in pursuing with these infrastructure projects. This was litigated, and then Baroness Hale says the following: "I have not found this an easy case. HS2 will be the largest infrastructure project carried out in this country since the development of the railways in the 19th century. Whatever the economic and social benefits it may bring, it will undoubtedly have a major impact on the environment." So what this means is that how do you balance modernity? How do you balance this advanced progressive society with environmental concerns? And perhaps the bigger question here is, well, who does the balancing? Should the court do the balancing, or is this entirely decided in the political forum? And these debates have been amplified by climate change. And this is the next slide. So again, if we zoom in on airports, Dumpelman here offers, again, a very nice description of what airports constitute. He here says that they're icons of modernity. Airports facilitate the development of a global economy during the 20th and early 21st century, reshaping the way people about the world see the world around them. So we have this idea of how we understand ourselves as a modern society, but at the same time, there is also the increased awareness about changing infrastructures, infrastructure patterns in order to deal with climate change. And here, this is Jasanoff and her co-authors writing about that we need to think about new energy futures, that we need to reconfigure the deep physical structures of civilization. So we need to rethink grids and pipelines and seashores, cities that were shaped by the energy choices of the past. So the way that climate change amplifies this kind of conflict is not only it's the fact that previously that the debate that was had. So, for example, in the HS2 case, it was very much about the issue of locality. So, environmental impact assessments can be challenged, and they require inclusion of consultation, but there is a locality issue. But here, what climate change here brings to the table is to think about not just current, but also future generations, not just in a specific society, but also society elsewhere. So how do we proceed? How do we reimagine, if at all, the deep structures of our society in time of climate change? So in order to think about this, we need to again kind of pause to think about what kind of issue is climate change from a legal perspective. And this is the next slide. Yeah, so climate change is a legal problem. Yeah. So a couple of kind of general points about climate change as a societal problem. And one of the kind of great descriptions of what climate change actually demands is here proposed by Reiner. So he said that climate change is not so much a discrete problem to be resolved or solved as it is a condition under which human beings will have to make choices about such matters as priorities for economic development and the way we govern ourselves. And this is a great description because what Reiner is basically saying is that we won't fix climate change and live happily ever after. What climate change has basically contributed to our societies is that we need to decide how to organize ourselves in this new reality. And this is tricky because what that means is that whichever choice you will make, you will create winners and losers. And this is work that is really, again, beautifully kind of laid out by my colleague here at Oxford, Elizabeth Fisher, where she talks about how climate change creates winners and losers. And for example, the yellow vests is a great example of how climate change policies can alienate a specific group of people that then end up on the losing side and others on the winning side, even if in the long term we would all be winners by taking action on climate change. But in the short term, we are creating winners and losers. And this is important, again, to kind of acknowledge, because what action on climate change then runs the risk of doing is to feed populism and populist politics. And this is something that I have worked on. So populism here is a real threat, and the choices, therefore, that we're making are not easy to make. So it's easy to say, let's all be like Greta. But we know that that is not going to work. So we are so the point here is to just recognize that there are no kind of silver bullets here. There are no magic wands with which we can just fix climate change. There are difficult decisions ahead. So what is then the role for law in all of this? And this is the next slide. So the role of law, this list looks incredibly short, but these are quite important. The role of law is essential, I should say, and each of these points is kind of fairly complicated in itself. But the role of law, I mean, first is to just recognize that law here exists at a multi-level governance system. So we don't have one source of law. We have multiple sources of law, and they are operating. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they clash, sometimes, they're developing at different speeds and at different periods and for different purposes. So it's a very complicated legal picture and legal landscape that is worth to recognize.
Maybe I could jump in there, just Sanja, because
absolutely.
specifically on the point of multi-level governance. I think that's really what intrigues me in this climate law issue, because with the climate issue, it was so clear that also not only climate but also a lot of other environmental issues are struggling in the legal landscape because of this multi-governance level, all the multi-level structure of governance, and we see that especially now when regarding, and we will come to that in how national climate acts, and also on European level, but also connected to the multi-level agreement in Paris. So I think with the climate issue, this notion of multi-level governance, which is what not new to environmental law, has been much more complicated, how to speak, or clear, or at least clearly identified itself as one of the main drivers for complexity.
Yeah. No, absolutely, yeah, and added to the fact that we have multiple sources, it's the issue here is also that climate change doesn't necessarily fit into existing legal frameworks very neatly. So climate change raises question of causation. It raises question about the fact that it's kind of cross-jurisdictional, the fact that we have both public and private actors, and these questions are not necessarily neatly squared into the legal frameworks that we already have. And this is again Fisher, together with other environmental law colleagues, that describe climate change as legally disruptive. So we can't easily apply the law and fix it. What this means is that the courts, for this reason, have played a hugely important role in adjudicating. So here there is a difference between litigation and adjudication. So adjudication is the delivery that the court gives, and by adjudicating, the courts are de facto stabilizing the disruptive nature of climate change. And what that basically means is that the court recognizing, yes, climate change is real. Yes, governments need to take action. That then stabilizes the hotly disputed and contested facts, and then acts as a stabilizer to these debates. So the law matters. It's not a magic wand. And courts here matter as well in reconciling climate change and the law at hand. So next slide, please. So if we look at, and as kind of was said at the outset, so by looking at the rule of law, we're here focusing on two issues. So one is legislation, and the second is the role of the courts. So if we look at legislation, and here this is the International Climate Change Treaty, the Paris Agreement, and this was very much a game changer. But it's here again kind of important to just recognize what Paris Agreement does, and I'm sure audience is very familiar with what the Paris Agreement actually says. The legal obligations are found in Article 4. So if we read subsection 1, it says that parties to the agreements, they aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. But here it's not, it's aiming as opposed to that they must reach. And the way that they aim to deal with greenhouse gases as soon as possible is by preparing and communicating a so-called national determined contributions that it intends to achieve. So it's basically up to each member or each party to commit to their own targets or to their own action plans. And what is here interesting about, something that we won't dwell on very much here today, is that what it basically means is that whichever plan you set up, that the following plans should be a progression. So you shouldn't regress from what you have already committed to doing. But it should, however, reflect the highest possible ambition. So you should do the best as you can as a party and not regress from that. So this is the legal backdrop at the international level. And also, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, it's just that there are multiple authors that have been written about this article, and also Paris Agreement, obviously, but especially on this, and I think you stressed it very well on this principle of progression and the reflection of highest possible ambition. Of course, this is language that is quite ambiguous when it comes to the perspective of having so many different states at the table, reflecting also a high degree of injustice between those that have emitted quite a lot in the history, members of the global earth that are not here anymore, of our fathers, but that have been building infrastructure in certain parts of the world, while other parts are still fighting for development in infrastructure, for example. So this is, this is really tricky language that will, I think, develop more on how much this is forming this process of negotiating, actually, also in the future. That's what Paris Agreement was about, to set a format for the states to still negotiating in the future for reaching the goal of emission reduction. And that is still to be proven if it works or not.
Yep. So if we move to the next slide. So if you remember from the previous slide, the highest possible kind of target. So what has followed in the Paris Agreement is then that individual parties have then developed their own legislation. And here countries across the world have been fairly ambitious, to say the least. So this slide is a bit kind of busy, perhaps, but we'll just provide a couple of examples here. So the UK Climate Change Act, the UK was one of the first, so this is way before Paris Agreement. They had a fairly ambitious target. And I should say that this is a target from 2008, and it has now been revised to, the section 1 has been revised to say that there will be net zero emissions by 2050. So there is a new target for UK. The EU is currently proposing a European climate law, which will also set out the net zero emissions target of all greenhouse gases by 2050. China has...
Sanja, a question of
yes.
clarification. Can you tell us what kind of emissions you're talking about? Is it domestic or consumption-based, or which kind of emissions?
Exactly. Well, if the legislation had said that, we wouldn't have had...
I get it.
Yes, but perhaps we can discuss that further. I will try to illustrate, well, not with the cases I have in the slides here, but I'm happy to discuss that question. That it's an excellent question, because this is the different targets don't necessarily cover the same greenhouse gases or the same. So it's a really great question. And the question about origin is also a really good one. Is it just, and this was something that was litigated in Norway, for example. I'm happy to discuss that in the questions. Yeah, I'll just say that here. I mean, I don't know if the audience is familiar with the Greenpeace case that was decided by the Norwegian Supreme Court recently. Was it March of this year? But the question there was that Norway still continues to issue permits to extract fossil fuels from its territory. And then the question is, well, this goes against the Paris Agreement. But what then the defense was that, well, these fossil fuels are not consumed in Norway, they're sold. And what the court in that specific case decided was, I mean, that was heavily litigated. That was that you could possibly include that the Supreme Court seemed to have suggested in the domestic targets. I mean, the appeal court refused it outright, but the Supreme Court seemed to have suggested that you could include it, but it didn't actually dwell on that question very much. It looked instead on constitutional rights of right of property. But as I said, I can discuss that in more detail in the discussions. The point here is that parties to the Paris Agreement have undertaken ambitious emission targets, and these are legal targets. And what is also interesting that they're based then on national law. Sweden here has also a climate act from 2018. It's very much, and this is something that Åsa has written a lot about, that it also kind of mimics a bit the Climate Change Act from the UK.
And for the Swedish emissions, the targets are clearly defined as to be territorial targets, so not consumption targets. So that is aligned to the Swedish reporting for the Paris Agreement, which are also in their reporting schemes, counting on the booking for Paris Agreement is on territorial emissions. But there is now set a committee to investigate how to actually in Sweden also at least measure the consumption targets better, and to align that with the Swedish overall target.
Yeah, I mean, I think an important point here is also that these laws, although they're responding to Paris Agreement, they are very much harbored in the legal culture of each country. So although we see kind of similar targets being undertaken, but what they actually cover and include will differ. But the point here is that the law has responded. The national legal systems have responded to Paris Agreement, and they have raised multiple legal questions. So the next slide, please. So what has followed legislation is so-called climate change adjudication, and we could probably spend days and days on end talking about climate change adjudications. This is something that, particularly the case law, is something that I, together with my colleagues here in Oxford, teach. And the syllabus and our case list is revised on a weekly basis. There are so many new cases popping out constantly. And I've given you here, I'll give you just very short 4 examples, and there are recent cases from March until June. So we have a case from the Canadian Supreme Court from March of this year. And the question that was litigated there was that whether the so-called Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was constitutional. So what this act did was to price carbon, and that was one of the main strategies that the current Canadian government had put forward to address climate change and to respond to the obligations of Paris. And this is the reference to previously how courts stabilize kind of contested facts. So here the court is saying that the history of efforts to address climate change in Canada reflects the critical role of carbon pricing strategies in policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There is a broad consensus among expert international bodies that carbon pricing is a critical measure for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. This matter is critical to a response to an existential threat to human life in Canada and around the world. There is a lot to unpick in what the court is saying. The fact that it, again, kind of, it stabilizes it basically says that carbon pricing is the way forward, which is also interesting, and that it embraces that as a regulatory strategy. And it says that climate change is an existential threat. And by saying that, you also open up to human rights litigation. And what's interesting here that it's not just in Canada, but it's around the world. So could that open for litigations and litigants in other parts of the world as well? So it's really interesting case law. It's really interesting what the court here is doing. A pretty controversial case has just been delivered last week or so by the Federal Court of Australia. And here, I mean, all these cases are, the Canadian case is more than 400 pages. So obviously we can discuss these cases in a lot of detail. I'm just quickly rushing through them here. This case was about whether a minister allowing again extraction of fossil fuels, if that minister has actually breached a duty of care to children, and these children were identified as children to that case. And here the court similarly talks about the law of negligence. And they say that in order to establish negligence or duty of care, the relationship that you need to look at is the harm and the relationship between the person causing the harm and the person being harmed. And they map that relationship onto the relationship between a minister in office and citizens of Canada, these specific children. And they say that there is a reasonable person in the position of the minister would foresee the basically increasing CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. It will foresee the increase in global surface temperature and the exposure that this would have on the children. So they may be exposed to risk of death or other personal injuries. And therefore, there is a duty of care owned by the minister to each of the children in the case. So this case law is very new. It's very fresh. The consequences are still being debated, but this may change the law of negligence entirely. So if we just move on to the next slide. We have the German Constitutional Court, also recently, this is again March of this year, they found that the German Federal Climate Change Act of 2019 was found in part to be unconstitutional because there were no specific plans for how emission reductions would be carried out for that specific period. And more recently, this was just the other week, the Dutch court in The Hague ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut emissions by 45% by 2030. And what this shows is that it's not just litigation or adjudication vis-a-vis public bodies, but also individual private actors. So as I said, the case law is really hard to keep track of, and it's occurring on all but one continent. And the courts here are playing a really important role in stabilizing these contested facts and issues and debates around climate change. And then we have, if we go back to our initial kind of starting point, well, how does this all fit into what we are talking about, infrastructure and airports and climate change? And this too has been adjudicated. So most recently we have, again, from the UK Supreme Court, the case before about Heathrow expansion. And this is the next slide, please. So the UK Supreme Court overturns a blockade that the appeal court had put on Heathrow's third runway. So if the audience has followed, this has been a debated issue for decades now in the UK about Heathrow's third runway. And this, again, this case was decided on very specific issues relevant to the legislation. So the question here was, did the Secretary of State, by failing to take into account kind of the UK's commitment to Paris Agreement, in setting out a so-called airport national policy statement? So there needed to be a policy statement, or there was a policy statement favoring the third runway. So by the Secretary of State not mentioning or failing to take Paris Agreement into account, was that then unlawful? And the whole case, which again is a meaty one and a quite kind of complicated one, is really about, well, what is government policy? Because under planning law, so UK or English planning law, you have to take into account government policy. And what the court here said was that Paris Agreement, and even the decision to ratify Paris Agreement, is not part of government policy. So the case is really about, well, what is law and what is policy, and what do you need to include and what do you not need to include as a minister. So the point here, which is kind of important to underline, is that it's easy to kind of just describe the courts here as being activist. But if we actually read these judgments in detail, what courts tend to do is really engage with whichever legal instrument they have in front of them. So the court here is applying the law. And it really depends on how that legal structure, how the legal context, what tools it allows them to use. So law really matters. Legislation really matters, is the point that is worth stressing here. So we can move to the next slide. And this is then Sweden as our case study. And then the next slide after that. Also, I don't know if you want to say something very quickly about that, or if I should, it's absolutely.
Well, you could introduce this, and I could take over then from this and the next slide if you want to.
Yeah, so very, very briefly, just so that we also allow for discussion and questions. So Sweden, as we've already laid out, took part or engaged or carried out ambitious Climate Act and also established this policy framework in 2018. And I guess there are kind of three features that are worth mentioning. One, about the processes. So there is a process introduced, which again, kind of, as we've already said, kind of builds on the UK processes, where there needs to be a climate report in the budget drawn up every year. And that there also needs to be kind of a climate policy action plan to describe how those targets are going to be achieved, and making sure that those two work together and are met. There is a long-term target that we've already identified, so zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2045 at the latest. And this is what Åsa has already said, that 85% need to be domestic emissions. And there is also kind of institutional innovation, that there is a climate policy council that delivers evaluations of what the government is doing. Very broadly described. Åsa, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, that's the work now is in progress, of course, is to see how this policy framework and the Climate Act will actually be used. And a colleague and I made a survey a year ago on what actually the actual implications of the Climate Act so far have been, and we were, for being lawyers, which are skeptic to these kind of frameworks, laws, how they actually are implemented in a legal system, as the Swedish one, which is very where courts and activism in courts is not what we do see in the system. Still, we were seeing that the Climate Act had implications for certain actions taken by agencies. And when we are discussing further infrastructure planning and airports, we can also see then that agencies and how the agencies are acting is quite important. So that is, I think, worth mentioning, that the Climate Act might have a bit broader implications also on the legal side than first mentioned by lawyers in Sweden, which were quite skeptic about the law, saying it was only telling the government what to do, and there had been no kind of legal measures to make any legal progress. But I think that is still to be seen, actually.
Great. So if we move to the next slide, and then this is the point about that in Sweden we have this ambitious in progress a framework in place, but then there are also airport expansion plans underway. And also, I don't know if you want to.
Yes, yeah. As we took this ongoing work between us, Sanja and I, we started to think about, especially on airports, and then coming from the perspective of having more legal tools in climate issues, how would this actually track down to the processes on airport expansions, as there are plans. As part as some of you might know, there has been, and now we're talking pre-COVID time, large plans for expansions on Swedish airports, especially on Arlanda, the biggest one, and the Stockholm airport. The plans had been on being not only one more runway, but two more runways, and that it would cope, I think, for 40 million passengers in 2030 or 40. That was the plans before COVID, and we now know that some of these plans, or some actors revised those plans, but there are still the context. What also lays in the history is that airport expansion has been quite debated also in climate issues, and there is a history of the permit of Arlanda, which were holding a carbon cap, which was actually set by the government, because that was set in a time when we did not have the environmental code, but by shifting the permits after the millennium, this carbon cap was lifted by the court, and especially since there was a lot of agencies, both the regional agencies of the county councils, but also from the agencies of transports and also the environmental agency. Actually, the EPA was not against lifting the carbon cap from the Arlanda. So this was already been debated in the time before Paris, and also, as I said, before COVID. Now there has been a debate, of course, posted both on the COVID crisis to airports, or to the, but also I would say, as I mentioned in the end of the slide here, that we had Sweden is famous when it comes to the world language on flygskam as well, with Greta Thunberg and so on. So it's very much connected also that there was a decline in air flights before COVID, and this has of course then been much more worse than that. So we don't know what the reality when it comes to flying is actually going, but what we can see when it comes to the legal framework, nothing has changed, and that is a bit interesting or challenging when you come with the new climate legal acts and goals and targets on climate emissions, because the praxis, or what the court was saying with the current rules and regulations, which were also set before Paris and before more strength climate before the Climate Act, for example, it was very clear that the court did not want to intrigue climate missions in the process of environmental permits. It rather firmly stated that global emissions, as the climate emissions, could not be included in the restrictions on the environmental permits on airports. And such a statement and that practice, I think, would be difficult how to align with a process where people try to see, and as Sanja is pointing at, around the world now we see more and more litigation on climate, but also more and more engagement in the issue in the way of on a much higher level of urgency than we have been seeing before. So what we have here is a legal framework that is set in one position and set in one time. The time 2009, that when this practice was more clearly brought by the court, was also the time when air transport went into the bubble of emission trading in the EU. So the court actually, in one of the sentences, was clearly referring to that since the global emission of climate should be taken care of elsewhere than in the courtroom of the environmental permit of the airport. So that was the clarification. And I think that is interesting, because as we're talking here about the role of the courts and the role of the courts to facilitate the tensions in the society, of course that is a way to say that this debate, or this challenging on climate emissions from airplanes, should not be debated in the courtroom when it comes to export expansion plans. But when and where should it then be debated? There will be a demand on clarifying such room for debate. And so far the courts have been saying and pointing at the policy arena and saying that this is about policy instruments elsewhere from the regulation on airports. And as I also mentioned on this slide, Sweden, and there has been now a policy challenging, coming rather, or pointing more on how to greener the airplanes and the airports, and also trying to have more of economic instruments, specifically on flights. So that is kind of a way of showing that this is maybe also from the politics and the lawmakers stating that they agree with the courts that climate emissions should not be debated in the court when it comes to airport expansion plans. However, this could, I think, be an intriguing and interesting area to follow, since the climate issue is so much on the agenda, and also to see on the role of the courts, of course, especially in the Swedish and Nordic system, that the role of the agency, how the agencies are expressing the special concerns raised, that there has been very few of the individual actors in these court processes that has been actually pointing at the climate issues. There have been environmental NGOs, but there have been very few such hard cases so far in the Swedish courts. But who knows? It might come. Maybe you want to add something there, Sanja, on the structure or the what questions we actually are looking for on this.
Yes, I mean it is really kind of I think what this also shows is the idea of how infrastructure is such a fundamental part of our society, but also with how we deal with climate change. But those two are not really reconciled in law. And I think also what you just explained shows that really kind of nicely. And if we go to the next slide, if we're going to stick to the Swedish context, we don't need to spend too much time on this. I think it's good if we kind of try to wrap up. I also kind of thinking, looking here at the watch, and to get to our questions. I think most of you in the audience would have come across the Preem litigation. And the question here, is this start of something new? I.e., the question here was whether an expansion of the Preem refinery in Lysekil, if that could be, if the permit is unlawful in light of the climate law that Sweden had put in place. And the environmental court here ruled that it wasn't, that it was permissible. Ultimately, the question was left to the government to decide on. And again, here, an extract from the Swedish newspapers of how politically sensitive these questions are. So in the sense, we see here, where should this question be decided? And it's again kind of coming back to the point about climate change decision-making will create winners and losers. And creating winners and losers is not a favorable political position to be in, because you will ultimately, you may win votes by acting a specific way, but you will also lose votes. So if it's not the government, should that question then be moved over to the courts? But on what grounds is the court then better positioned to decide these cases? So this is just something as a backdrop to the three following questions, discussion points that we have. So this is the next slide. So the road ahead, and as we said at the outset, we have really kind of three. I mean, I think in Sweden we do see that we are kind of at a crossroads with regards to kind of three different specific points. So one is about legislation. So we need to rethink the legislation, but how? And what the Preem decision showed was that the climate law was found not to be legally binding. And we can go into the reasons why it wasn't in that specific case. But it has then initiated this klimaträttsutredning, which is about, well, how do we then need to rethink the climate code in Sweden to take into account climate change, including on infrastructure. So Åsa, I don't know if you want to add, so you're sitting on quite a few of, as a legal expert.
Well, this survey investigation was initiated before the Preem case, and it was, as you said, initiated because of what the Climate Act was actually giving the responsibility to the government, although the government saw that they couldn't take the full responsibility for the climate emissions in Sweden without having greater tools implemented in the legal in the environmental law, so to speak. So what this committee has been doing so far, they have investigated especially on these environmental permits for environment hazardous activities, and try to shape up a road ahead for Sweden to be able to take some action also on these point sources, which are under the European emission trading scheme, which was actually one of the previous discussions on the Prima case. And they will go on search also for other parts of the Swedish legislation to see if there are other changes to be made to make the power of the government and therefore the agencies to work aligned with the Climate Act. So this one could see as a traditional way of the Swedish legal system to work, that make the politics decide on the legal structure, and as long it's not decided, then the courts are assumed to take decision based on unprepared legislation, which of course in this case with climate change will be an intriguing part.
Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, and then we can have it's kind of again coming back to the idea, well, should courts in Sweden have a more prominent role? And what's interesting here is that these discussions are coming through proposals in kind of rethinking the law and the jurisprudence or the jurisdiction given to the courts. So here it's looking to what extent the court should have expanded jurisdiction in looking at permit assessments in particular. And this is just one example of one current proposal looking at to what extent the courts may have a greater role to play, not necessarily in the adjudication, but in looking at the permit assessments and the expertise that is needed in carrying out those permit assessments or approvals. So Åsa, again, I don't know if you want to add any specific.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to see that what's happening now is actually, and that was highlighted already in the first delivery or first proposal delivered by the Klimaträttsutredningen, that actually what they confirmed was that yes, climate change or climate emissions are included in the aims of the environmental code, and that was quite a surprising statement in the way of, well, didn't we all know that for the sake of sustainability and environment, which is the aim of the environmental code, of course, climate change is included. I mean, that is the by far biggest environmental issue at the table at the moment. But they still saw that they needed to say that and also actually shape some of the environmental code to get that clear, since the court praxis in past years has been clearly pushing away the global emissions and only looking at local environmental effects where you don't have the climate issue at the table. So that was one part. And the other part was, of course, also, which I think this is more of a, according to this question, more relevant, is to see an ongoing debate how to get the court to be more active, viewing initiatives on private actors that are seeking permissions for activities, to also reviewing how these activities actually can promote change, promote transformation of society into a more sustainable or climate neutral, kind of contributing to the climate targets. And that has been not being a part of what the courts are supposed to do so far, since of course then it will be And I think that would be a challenging debate. What would be the role of the courts to say, okay, this kind of activity is really important. We need that to transform a certain sector in society, while there is another activity that might not in the first look like it could really have. I mean, there is a lot of activities that, do we want the courts to discuss whether an activity is kind of good and bad for the society, and in what way should they do that? So that is a much more intriguing discussion to come.
So Sanja and Åsa, it's high time to wrap up so we can have some questions.
Yeah, so this is the final slide that we can just very quickly. So this is the next slide, and then we are one question that is. So what we've talked so far is: do we need to rethink the law? Well, and again, this is the context in Sweden. Do we need to rethink the role of the courts? Something that we see kind of more globally, but also in Sweden, is well, is there instead a safe haven found in technologies? So we see here increasingly political statements which basically say that cutting emissions will basically come from future technologies. And so-called greenhouse gas removal strategies. And the UK government is heavily investing in this path forward. So it allocated 30 million just the other week to different directorates and a hub that's based in Oxford, and that I have joined also as a legal investigator. So looking at not only how do we change our existing infrastructure, but how do we create new markets to reduce or to take emissions out of the atmosphere. So perhaps we don't need to rethink the conflict between how we see modern societies and climate change. Perhaps technologies is the way forward. And that is a huge question mark. So thank you so much for your time, and apologies for running over the allocated time. So happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, and join me in thanking the two speakers so far. And we're now going to get into the question and answer period, and I will tell you how to do that. So if you wish to ask a question, you should write it in the chat. And since we are a mix of researchers from different fields, please tell me your area of study too, so we can ensure that we take questions from different disciplines. So write your name and area of study, for example, Gustav, philosophy. We also have follow-up questions. So you just write follow-up to the person that just asked a question in the chat. And then I take the follow-ups before I take new questions. And when it's your turn, I call on you, and then you should put your video and sound on and ask your question out loud. And let me see, do we have a first question? Okay, so there's no first question. Then I'll go for the first question, then have the opportunity to do this. Which one should I pick? Well, so here's a question for you, for us who's not a legal scholar. I mean, you took a lot of very, very interesting cases. And of course, there are different legal systems in like UK, United States, Australia, which are more common law system. And then we have Sweden that have a more kind of Napoleonic code system. And of course, the very interesting thing, or one of the things I find the most interesting, is this litigation. And I just wonder if you can tell us more about it. It seems kind of clear for me as a layman in the field that litigation is much more possible, for example, in the system that the United States have. And you also have a history of using that for environmental causes and also, of course, on tobacco. But is there anything, I mean, Sweden doesn't seem to be on the forefront when it comes to that kind of litigation. So if you could tell us a bit more about that, that would be great to hear.
Yeah. Elsa, do you want to start, or?
Well, you can start. I've been looking more on litigation.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The common law courts have been more on the forefront of the very kind of exciting climate change cases that we see around the world. And the Norwegian case that was mentioned is taken also as an example. I mean, the outcome there was thought to be very, very restrictive. So what the Supreme Court basically did was to say that, yes, there is a human right here in place that the government may have infringed, but the threshold for infringing it is very, very high when the government acts, and therefore they didn't find that they had breached any human rights in this specific issue, but continuing to issue permits to extract fossil fuels in the Norwegian territory. And as I said, so this case, also by Norwegian domestic lawyers, have been described as being unnecessarily restrictive. And it's very much being kind of the Nordic judicial culture of not wanting to interfere of what is seen as a kind of governmental matters. Yes, and the Preem case is the court was similarly extremely restrictive of how it interpreted the law and how it saw itself and its own role as a court. And in a sense, there was nothing, I think, in the law. I mean, also as I said, you're much better positioned to reply to the specific kind of Swedish law. But the way I read that case and the way that I read the relevant legislation is that the court could have been more creative. The court, I find, having been unnecessarily restrictive. And perhaps that's also part of the legal education that the courts and the judges have had, and that is part of the legal culture. But the question here is climate change, or will climate change push for courts to have a different role than they have had to date? And what's interesting here, and this is kind of one of the final slides, is that push doesn't necessarily come from the court itself, but that push may come from legislation. So that we see legislation actually saying, listen, judges, you do have this responsibility, and you have to kind of decide on these specific issues. So I think that could be kind of an interesting, the way that climate change kind of, again, is changing law, is changing institutions, and is changing societies. But Åsa, you do disagree with me if
no, I think it's very interesting since you, Sanja, sitting in Oxford in a bit of a good distance and you could look at different systems. I think it's very worth it to hear your comments from the Swedish internal perspective, as I've been in some discussions on climate litigation for in Sweden, and I think and I know that Professor Ebbison had been writing on this, and also some of the other Swedish environmental lawyers. Intriguing, especially how could you enter into the Swedish court on such a case. We have had the one case that wasn't successful at all, was called Magnolia case, and there has been discussions then of how to enter such a case in Sweden. I think there will come cases that in the global perspective we will identify as climate litigation. But I think maybe two things are important to mention when it comes to Sweden. Compared to Norway, we don't have the extraction of oil, so there is not this this kind of and if you compare to the Netherlands, for example, the Urgenda case, the current targets, the policies are there. The overacting policies with the targets are there. The problem is the implementation. The problem is how to actually get the emissions down, and that will. I think that in the area of where emissions come from and which actors are handling these activities that are giving the emissions, like the Preem case, when actually there was a big debate also on the court side, or from outside, from the environmental NGOs, on stressing the court and forcing the court to take the much more clear stand than they wanted before, because as I said, it's a system where also the agencies are very important. So when the agencies are acting, the issue of climate change is also raised in the court. But we do have also a system which is not excluding or quite open to enter to court, I think, when it comes to especially physical planning and other activities in the local hood. So there is possibilities to enter, and I'm sure that will be climate litigation, but it will look differently in Sweden, like it does in other countries. All activities with the legal system will accordingly be successful only if it find ways in that specific legal system, and so it will be in Sweden as well. And maybe since Sweden is not a big emitter or extracting oil since in Norway, and also have the targets in place, that is not the first country where to have. But maybe a fourth and fifth runway on Arlanda will be a case on climate litigation. That's I can't exclude that.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I have more questions about that, but we should let some other people come in. So the next person is Göran. Göran, are you with us?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm here. You can hear me, I hope.
Excellently.
So thank you for the presentation. It was super interesting. If I could strike a critical note, I found it a little bit difficult to follow exactly what the core claim was in the presentation, but it sounded like the question was whether we need to change the relationship between law and policy in order to ensure environmental sustainability, or yes, it sounded like there was a normative component to the paper, like whether this is something that we ought to do. And my question is, comment rather, is I would want to hear your thoughts about the skeptical perspective. Should we do it that way? So I'm a political scientist, and in political science, we have this term judicialization of politics, which is the move by elected politicians to let courts decide core moral disagreements and public policy decisions, which is often a clever strategy, because as Sanja said, it can be uncomfortable to make those political decisions. So it could be politically advantageous to task the courts to settle these issues for politicians. And I think that sounds fine. Now, the other side is judicial activism, which is courts telling elected politicians that they have to do something that they rather not do. And here's where I have my concerns, because, I mean, the risk is that we're hijacked here in assessing the system by our understandable desire to protect the environment. But we can easily imagine other public policy choices where judicial activism could look much worse in our eyes, right? Because let's suppose in the future courts would be the conservative force here, and they would not act to protect the environment, or take an adjacent another case like abortion. There's a tradition of courts being anti-progressive on this issue. So I'm not sure if the message of the talk here is that climate change is going to force us to put more power into unelected decision makers. I'm not sure I like that. Do you?
Yeah. Also, do you want me to? No. Okay. No, I'm happy to go with that. Thank you so much. And I think the point about the core claim, the fact that it's a bit kind of unclear, I completely take that on board. So just as we said, we are still mapping out this paper, and I'm really thankful that the audience is still engaged and stuck with us for an hour listening to. So thank you for that. So there are a lot of points here that you raised that I think are really interesting and worth discussing. So law and policy, and again, here I have to make, as I said, I'm Swedish, but I'm educated. My legal education is in the UK, so I'm influenced very much by the British legal culture. So law and policy is not that the distinction is not as vast in the courts here as there are in other places. So policy can be legally binding, and has been found to be legally binding in some contexts. And we see that not just in the British courts, we see that also in the EU courts. For example, policy papers having found to have legal effect. So it's not so much about should we blur the line between law and policy, because I think in environmental law that line has already been blurred. But the role of the courts, I think, is interesting. I mean, I think what's interesting when looking at climate change litigation or adjudication, and again, this is a point. I mean, I discussed that in very broad brushes. I didn't look at them in very much detail. But what most of those cases show is that the courts are looking at whatever legislation or policy they have in front of them. So they're not acting on their own accord. Just as Åsa said with Urgenda, it's very much harbored in the national legal system. Also with the kind of quite controversial Australian federal court case similarly. So it's really important that we don't, I think, see these cases as judicial activism, because the court is engaging thoughtfully with the law that it has in front of itself. But what I find interesting, I mean, the interesting example that Sweden, I think, provides with regards to Prim, it's also thinking, well, where are these decisions decided? And I think this is also the question you raise. Is it the legislator? But as we've said, these decisions are really uncomfortable, so they may want to avoid them. And perhaps in some instances, they may actually want to leave it to the court, because then if the court, as you also have said, if the court then says you have to act, then they can blame the court, but still do something about it. What's interesting, what I find with the Payne case, is that it wasn't decided either by the court or by the government. It was very much the pressure by the civic society. And we have climate rebellion. We have, the Greta movement. And here as a lawyer, I'm a bit uncomfortable with these really important decisions being decided on the streets. So I'm very much in favor of these decisions being decided by institutions. So through law, that then the courts apply. And that the courts can apply not restrictively as the Swedish court in Prim has done, but actually make sure that the law is actually given effect. I hope that makes sense, but I'm happy for you to push back on any of the stuff.
It was better than I deserved. Thank you.
So you were happy with that, Göran?
But could I just go comment?
Yeah,
sorry, because what I said no in the front row was not that I didn't want to answer, I think, or thank for the question, but rather that I said no to legal activism in the way of, in the theoretical way, as you put it. And I think, Sanja, you made the point clear that was not our point, but rather, and I think we were clear in the end, although we have been so clear so far with this paper, as it is not even produced yet, that one way for the courts to deal with it, having an important role, taking its role seriously, is of course also to pointing back and help political accountable. That's also why we do have the legal system, and it's an important part of the legal system. So by at least allowing. And I think with the change, the speed of the change that we need to take on climate change, and for society, this is a huge challenge to transform with such a speed. Courts are necessary to help society and the political system and lawmakers to speed up, and by clarify the issues, and also by pointing at where and when and how those issues could be identified in a structured way, as to speak, being a bit in between the people on the street debate and the old institutions and the lawmakers that need to be thinking ahead. So I think that that's more the room that we see here.
Okay, so then it's time for the next question, and that's Julia.
My question?
Yeah, of course, Miles has a problem with his microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So I have a question that is more of a clarification question. So I was wondering whether the expansion plans of these airports, say Arlanda, or at a bigger scale, the Heathrow expansion, whether they're driven and publicly justified on an actual increase of demand from passengers. I mean, it's really hard to tell what the demand might be after the pandemic, right? So I was just thinking if you could elaborate a bit on what you think the drivers for the expansion might actually be, and if they actually appealed to that when they put it forward. Thank you. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, well, if I could start, I think by picking airports as a interesting topic for this, I also foresee that this question I'm also interested in as you speak up. Would it still be such a view of society that expansion of airports would be kind of a symbol for a good society moving ahead, or could we see a change in that? What I can see is, of course, that it's really demanding to visualize where is this demand come from. Is it coming really from individuals wanting their rights to meet and flourish their lives, or is it the demand created by vested interests that want to sell resorts and tourism in a way, saying that that's the only way of happiness to reach a beach with the sun all day around, or is it more like or is it to be a good, I mean, an interesting job is to have a job where you could travel a lot or not? I mean, that's a lot of ideals. What is our ideal of society? And I think what the pandemic's been showing interestingly is, of course, how could we enjoy connections and so in different ways. So that would be really interesting to see. But I think, and that's another area of research, how is demand of travels created? It's very clearly, if you just look how politicians are arguing for the laws and why they should permit expansions on airports. Airports are a lot of state infrastructure. So of course, what we do see here is policies or politicians that are both lawmakers for the legal structures for how infrastructure investments are made, but they are also the ones directing the agencies that actually owning the airports and wanting to expand. So that's a very tight conclusion there. And much of the political arguments is, of course, also showing the wanting to have the country to be seen more in the global way, more connections, therefore more investments in export industries and money. That's the argument. But it's very few critical views in the process of such an environmental permit, for example, that are kind of critical to, is that a demand that's it's important or not, or for whom is it important?
Yeah.
So I don't have much to add. I think just to go back to what Åsa, this is the clear example of how infrastructures are promotional. It's in a sense we do phrase them and think of them as in a very kind of promotional way. You do want to be part of the world. Yes. So that was just what I wanted to add.
You satisfied? Okay. So I have a follow-up on that, and it's quite a big follow-up in one way. But there was one kind of infrastructure that you didn't mention, and that is quite a big emitter, and I think it would be good if your paper looked at it, and maybe you're already doing it, and that's the military infrastructure, which is a big emitter, and also, have a lot of both airports and other things. Is that something you're looking into?
No, we haven't. No.
Well, that's an intriguing question. There could be a follow-up article, maybe.
Yes, exactly.
But I think you get into another complexity when it comes to, because
but it's interesting because it's also in the when you calculate national or territorial emissions, and there's a lot of oddities with loopholes about that, and it seems to be used out, and it's quite a lot.
I mean, it's interesting.
Well, the whole fly industry is kind of out from the calculation of national emission targets, and that is the big loophole, and which was a loophole that was identified already in Paris. European Union was not very happy with the conclusion that was ruled out from Paris Agreement.
And shipping too, huh?
Shipping as well.
Yeah, that's international bulk.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting looking at the Canadian case of, I mean, again, this is the point about, it's really interesting to look at how courts discuss climate change. So by saying that climate change poses an existential threat, that could, just following on what you said, Gustav, that could, in a sense, bring in the military of kind of, well, if this is the existential threat, then military's purposes should be kind of reconfined to kind of address that threat, right? If it's no longer wars with kind of, our neighbors, but it's the war on climate change. But that would be a different paper, I think.
That's a different thing, but that's also something
might be the electrification of the army.
Exactly.
Sorry, I forgot to put it on. Yeah, so Miles have a question, but he has promised his microphone, so I will interpret his question. He's want to know about zero emissions that target, as in the Paris Agreement, and he wonders what is the allowable offsets under the Paris Agreement when you go for the zero emissions. And I guess, I'm sure that's a legal question, but maybe you can answer it anyway.
Well, it's not really decided how the offset possibilities will be, because what was made, it's my interpretation from the negotiations in the Kyoto Agreement, there was an offset possibilities between the Annex 1 countries that had their commitments and the other countries that didn't have commitment, and then you created the CDM that was a tool for that. With the Paris Agreement, where all countries on the globe has commitments, it's not. I mean, it's not sure how you create an offset area. What you can do is of course that you could support each other to decrease emissions, but who will get kind of the climate certificate for that decrease? And that is still debated, because that is Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, which has not been set yet how to interact right now. And what was set in Paris was an hilarious compromise where you have two totally different systems just outlined very theoretically, and you cannot use them. And one is the Bolivian one, which is more of a natural earth statement, which is it's nobody in the Western world really see how it could act like a market. And then you have a market mechanism, which the Western countries wanted and which was kind of development on the Kyoto. But of course also the countries understood that with all countries having commitments, the mechanism would not work in the same way. And we have seen that when it comes to developing countries, of course wanting a lot of support technically, economically, and they demand justice for that. But they just don't want to say that, okay, we sell the cheap emission decrease, and we and we get all the expensive one to do ourselves. So, well, the short answer is that this is not decided yet how to get offset, but there will be, and I mean, we do see in climate, what do you call it in English, klimatkompensera, the climate compensation market, which is huge right now, but it's unregulated, and it's not. It's hard to see how that is transformed into the national contribution plans to Paris.
Yeah. So Miles was writing in a clarification here. So I think this is what his question is about. That if the courts have been asked to determine, for example, that an airport expansion are within climate goals, isn't it very hard for them to do that if the measurements are poorly defined? And who decides these measurements? I think that's what Miles is after. So, I mean, you have this Paris Agreement, but is there, so to say, how you should, how to measure how you fulfill your goals? Is that up to the courts, or is there a big latitude there? And how does the legal system deal with that?
I mean, I think what's interesting there, and I hope that was that was made clear in the presentation, that the courts in adjudicating, they're really looking at national law. So if we actually look at the Paris Agreement and Article 4, the obligation is to have so-called national these national plans. But it's based on those national plans that the courts are really pushing the governments to or are reviewing governmental action. I mean, this is in a sense what a bit of what the Heathrow case was about. The court basically said that Paris in itself is not reviewable. It's not a policy, a governmental policy that the national legislation kind of takes into account. The question then, I mean, the tricky legal question is then, well, these targets are all for, 2045 or 2050, or in China's case, 2060. So at which point can you actually push for action? And this is also something, because targets the UK targets at least have been achievable. So it raises kind of tricky questions about targets and to what extent they're legally binding and when. I don't know if that helps to answer the question.
Yeah, and of course the difficulties in any such question will be the decreasing space for emissions. Who in the society, in the national society, is going to have that space? Is it transport sector? Is it the airports? Is it the industry that's exporting things? And that has so far this is totally in the arena of the policymaker, of course, to define. But as long as they don't define, and if we go further another 10 years and don't define it, this need to be settled, because you cannot at first have those targets and also say that these targets are important for human rights, and then not defining how to reach them, so to speak. So it comes down to the national plans, and of course the scrutiny from the national agencies on what is the tools and possibilities to divide the task of emission reduction.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to that question, I mean, I think the German case is a good illustration of that. So the courts don't decide on the strategies, but they can say, for example, well, you have no clear strategies in place, and this is exactly what Åsa said. And in order for those targets that you have committed yourself to be achievable, you need to put strategies in place. So that the court can do, but the court cannot go and say you need to have carbon pricing. But in the Canadian case, carbon pricing already existed, and there the court said, yes, carbon pricing is kind of a good strategy. It is a strategy that kind of the government is legitimately pursuing. So there are kind of, there are different roles for the court. I mean, there's certain things that the court cannot do, but certain things that it's definitely within its ambit of power to do. And this is, I guess, coming back to Jaron's point about an activist court, or actually a court that just applies the law and interprets the law that exists.
Thanks. Then we have a question from Tim.
Yeah, thanks. So I have actually a couple of questions. One is about the 3 questions that you posed at the end. So one thing you said is that if we could find safe haven in new technologies, maybe we don't have to worry about rethinking, legislative rethinking or rethinking the role of the judiciary. So that suggested that these things were mutually exclusive, and I didn't see why they were. I don't see why you couldn't do all 3. And then, so the other thought was about the 3 questions was, you consider a number of different countries, and it seems to me that the answer to the question, where should we focus when we consider these 3 changes, might be different depending on what country you look at. So it may be possible that there isn't a general answer that applies across countries. So reimagining the role of the judiciary seems like it would be less viable a strategy in a country like the United States than it would be in a country where the judiciary has a bit more latitude. So that's just a couple of comments on the 3 questions. And then my second question is just going back to Gustav's first question. It's just a clarification. So Gustav asked whether the laws that you were discussing in the presentation were talking about emissions from consumption or emissions from production, and there wasn't an answer to that. It was unclear or something, and I just didn't see why there wasn't an answer. Is it that the laws don't say anything about that distinction or don't specify it? Anyway, so that's it.
Yeah. I mean, Åsa, do you want me to start? Or, yeah?
I could just take the last one. Start.
Sure. Okay. Safe haven, you're absolutely right. These are not mutually exclusive. And I was unfair to the new technologies in suggesting there were. I think there is just a risk of seeing that innovation will solve everything and that we don't need to change as a society. And that is why I possibly hinted to that these would be kind of counterproductive. But I think it's quite clear that reaching net zero by 2045 or 2050 in the pace that we're going now is probably unlikely. So we do need technologies. They're not mutually exclusive, but I think we need to be careful of putting all our eggs in the innovation basket. And with regards to the 3 questions, and specifically about rethinking law and rethinking the role of the court, this would be very much in relation to Sweden and how law is being rethought and the role of courts is being rethought in Sweden. And regarding the consumption and production, Åsa, if you wanted to say something about the Swedish example, which is clear.
Well, I mean, that depends on which law you're looking, if it defines or not what kind of emission that it's looking at. If you, for example, look at a human rights perspective on climate law, which is coming up quite extensively in different cases, also in Europe, that I would say it's not defined if the emissions are domestically territory emissions by the booking rules of Paris, or if it's consumption and more like responsibility emissions. What is the emission that we are responsible? And you could, of course, connect the responsibility to a country or the responsibility to private actors or individuals. And that would, in different system, would depends on the perspective of the particular case that the court has. But when it comes to state responsibility, as the states themselves has coordinated them in the Paris agreement, then they have sorted quite clearly, and that has been all the COP conferences since Paris has been to agreeing on the booking rules for climate emissions and the national reports on how much emissions each and every country actually are emitting. That is very clearly specified, and those reports you could download them from the UN website to transparently look at what kind of emissions is connected to this country and this country and this country. And then of course you could add the question: is it fair that Norway, that digging up a huge lot of oil, do not have more emissions than they have, because of that the oil is not accounted for on Norway, but on the countries where the gasoline, for example, is sold. So that is the debate, but there is, of course, depending what legal structure you're looking at, it is defined which emissions are to be looked at.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Joran, you had a finger on this point, a follow-up.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think it's an incredibly fascinating question, the emissions accounting method. So I take it that no one objects to consumption-based emissions accounting if it's just for information purposes. But if we're talking about changing the rules for constructing these national emissions inventories, and maybe this is primarily for you, Åsa, because you've been close to the political action, there's a disagreement. And this is going off a tangent now, admittedly. There's a disagreement whether, if we want to have sustainability, do we have time to take a fight on how to construct these national emissions inventories? My view is that we don't have time for it, so we should keep the territory-based emissions accounting system. Whereas other people say that no, if you want to have more ambition globally in international climate politics, then switching would be very good. So it would be very good for the climate to take that fight. So if you feel like commenting on that, I'd be most interested. Thank you.
Well, I would be happy to have a discussion with you on that more extensively. But so let us talk later then. But a short answer would be that do they exclude each other? Because my point of view taking on that issue is that you probably need both. You shouldn't definitely. I mean, there is a risk of letting the booking rules as they are out in the blue, so to speak, because then the system as which is set is losing a lot of years. But you definitely need, as we will see, I think, especially in the climate litigation cases and the debate. And the debate of what is climate justice, that this bigger issue of responsibility cannot be solved by referring to the booking rules of territorial emissions. That need to be drawn in much more specific cases, and it should be differently. And what I find it interesting, and what I think it's going to maybe be a bit of a change maker, is of course that private actors now, when they do climate targeting in the market, I mean, when they do it as a private actor in companies, they do it in the scope 1, 2, and 3 perspective, where the scope 3 is this perspective where a company is responsible for their customers and the people they buy products from, what kind of emission they have, and how could they actually facilitate a decrease of emissions also from in the customer phase, and also in the phase before the company. So I think the perspectives of consumer issues are already there. Just pave the way for it. But don't think it. At least I have very hard to say that this is necessary to crack down the booking rules from Paris on territorial emissions, because that is one way of keeping the booking. And the only way that it's legally there at the moment.
A slight follow-up on that. I mean, there are also the loopholes. Maybe it's more important to get loopholes rather than talking about
like the flights and the
and
and the shipping
and the shipping and all that. But and there are some other ones, I think. But I know.
Yes.
But on that point, I'm afraid we've been running over time, which just shows how interesting this talk was and the discussion. So join me in thanking Åsa and Sanja so much for this. And I
think we should thank for all good questions that really help us being a bit more structured in our work.
That's good. So what's happening now, I should mention that we have a talk coming up, the next research seminar. That's James Fishkin. The title is to be announced, but probably about deliberative polls or something like that. And otherwise, the official part of the seminar is over, but you're welcome to hang on for another 10 minutes and just informally talk. So Åsa and Sanja, if you have time, you can stay online just to talk informally. Thank you very much.